Settler Girl escaped a forced auction. Until the judge declared she was his hidden heir, she stood on that auction block like cattle for sale. Until the judge who was about to sentence her discovered she carried his own blood in her veins. The morning sun had not yet burned the chill from the air when they came for Mercy Whitman. She heard their boots on the porch boards before dawn, heavy and deliberate, like the footsteps of men who had done this work too many times before. Through the cracked window of her father's cabin, she watched Sheriff Dalton tip his hat to the banker, Silas Morton, whose pale hands clutched a stack of papers that would decide her fate. "Time to settle your daddy's debts, girl," Morton called through the door, his voice thin as winter wind. "Court order says you come with us." Mercy's fingers found the worn wooden cross that hung around her neck, the only thing of her mother's she still owned. Everything else had been sold, piece by piece, as her father's gambling debts grew like weeds after rain. The furniture, the livestock. Even her mother's wedding ring had disappeared into the poker games that consumed Thomas Whitman like fever. She dressed in her only good dress, the blue cotton one her mother had sewn before the consumption took her voice, then her breath, then her life. The fabric was faded now, patched at the elbows, but it still smelled faintly of the lavender her mother used to press between the pages of her Bible. The walk to the courthouse felt like a funeral procession. Sheriff Dalton walked beside her, his spurs chiming with each step, while Morton followed behind with his papers and his satisfaction. The townspeople emerged from their shops and homes to watch, their faces a mixture of pity and curiosity. Some had known her since she was small enough to hide behind her mother's skirts. Others whispered behind their hands about Thomas Whitman's daughter, wondering how much she might fetch. The courthouse stood at the center of Clearwater Settlement like a monument to judgment itself. Its weathered what had seen more tears than rain, more confessions than prayers. Judge Thaddeus Caine's courtroom occupied the second floor, accessed by stairs that creaked under the weight of guilt and innocence alike. Mercy had been inside only once before, when she was 12 and her father had been arrested for disturbing the peace. She remembered the smell of old wood and older secrets, the way the morning light slanted through dust motes that danced like spirits in the air. Most of all, she remembered Judge Caine himself, sitting behind his bench like God's own accountant, his steel-gray eyes missing nothing. Now, 5 years later, she climbed those same stairs to face the same man, but this time she was not a witness to her father's shame. She was the payment for it. The courtroom was fuller than she expected. Word traveled fast in a settlement where entertainment was scarce and other people's misfortunes provided the only theater in town. Merchants, ranchers, and even some of the working girls from the saloon had come to watch the proceedings. They sat on wooden benches that had heard more lies than truths, their faces expectant. Judge Caine entered from his chambers with the measured pace of a man who had learned to carry the weight of other people's lives without letting it show. He was taller than Mercy remembered, his black coat hanging loose on a frame that had once been broader. His hair, silver now where it had been dark, was combed back from a face that might have been handsome before the years of rendering verdicts had carved lines of judgment around his eyes. He took his seat behind the bench and reached for his gavel, the same piece of maple wood that had fallen on countless decisions. The sound it made when it struck the block was like thunder trapped in a box, sudden and final. "This court is now in session," Judge Caine announced, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades on the bench. "We are here to settle the matter of the estate of Thomas Whitman, deceased, and the disposition of his remaining assets." Remaining assets. The words hit Mercy like a slap. She was not a person in this room. She was property to be distributed, a debt to be collected. Morton stood and cleared his throat, shuffling his papers with the importance of a man who held other people's lives in his hands. "Your Honor, the deceased owed a total of $347 in gambling debts, plus interest. The cabin and its contents have been sold to cover $200 of that amount. The remaining balance must be satisfied. And how do you propose to satisfy this balance, Mr. Morton?" "The girl, Your Honor. Mercy Whitman. She can work off the debt through indenture." I have several interested parties who would be willing to take responsibility for her labor in exchange for assuming the debt. The judge's eyes found Mercy then, and she felt something strange pass between them, like recognition without memory. He studied her face with the intensity of a man solving a puzzle, his gaze moving from her auburn hair to her green eyes to the determined set of her jaw. "Miss Whitman," he said, and his voice was softer than she expected. "Do you understand the proceedings?" Mercy stood, her legs unsteady beneath her. "Yes, sir. I understand that I'm to be sold to pay for my father's mistakes." A murmur ran through the courtroom, but Judge Caine's gavel silenced it with a single strike. "You are not being sold," he said, though his voice carried no conviction. "You are being bound to service to satisfy a legal debt. Is there a difference, Your Honor?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Judge Caine's hands, she noticed, had begun to tremble slightly where they rested on his bench. When he looked at her again, there was something in his eyes that had not been there before, something that looked almost like pain. "The bidding will now commence," Morton announced, stepping forward with his papers. "Who will assume Miss Whitman's debt in exchange for her labor?" The first voice came from the back of the room. $50 and her service for 2 years. It was Jake Brennan, who owned the largest ranch outside town and was known for working his hand from dawn to dusk. 75 and 3 years, called out Mrs. Henderson, who ran the boarding house and needed help with the endless cooking and cleaning. The bids continued, each one adding years to Mercy's life, each one reducing her to a commodity to be bartered and sold. She stood in the center of it all, her hands clasped in front of her, trying to hold on to the last shreds of her dignity, while men and women decided her future as if she were a horse or a plow. Judge Caine watched it all in silence, his gavel resting and used in his hand. Something was happening to his face, a gradual transformation that Mercy could not quite understand. The cold authority was melting away, replaced by something rawer, more human. The bidding had reached $150 when Judge Caine suddenly brought his gavel down with such force that several people jumped. "The bidding is closed," he announced. Morton looked confused. "But, Your Honor, we haven't reached the full amount of the debt, and I said the bidding is closed." The judge's voice carried a finality that brooked no argument. He looked directly at Mercy, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. "Miss Whitman's debt will be assumed by this court. She will be remanded to my custody until such time as the debt is satisfied." The courtroom erupted in whispers and speculation, but Mercy heard none of it. She was staring at Judge Caine, trying to understand what had just happened, trying to read the expression on his face that seemed equal parts determination and regret. As the crowd began to file out, disappointed that the entertainment had ended so abruptly, Judge Caine gathered his papers with hands that shook slightly. When he looked at Mercy again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Come with me, child. We have much to discuss." And as Mercy followed the judge from his courtroom into the uncertain future that awaited her, she could not shake the feeling that her salvation might prove to be something far more complicated than freedom. In the judge's silent house, every room held secrets. And when Mercy found her mother's locket in his desk drawer, she realized the man who saved her might be the one who destroyed her family. Judge Caine's house sat at the edge of Clearwater Settlement like a man who had chosen exile over community. It was a modest structure, built from the same weathered wood as the courthouse, but without any of that building's sense of authority. Here, among the cottonwoods that lined the dry creek bed, the house seemed to slump into itself, as if weighed down by the silence that lived within its walls. Mercy followed the judge up the stone path, her few possessions bundled in a worn carpet bag that had belonged to her mother. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the porch, and she noticed how the judge paused at his own front door, his hand hovering over the brass handle as if entering his own home required some form of courage. "Welcome to your new quarters, Miss Whitman," he said, though his voice carried no warmth. The words seemed to cost him something, like a man speaking a foreign language he had not used in years. The interior of the house revealed itself in degrees, each room darker than the last. Heavy curtains blocked most of the natural light, and the furniture was sparse and functional. A horsehair sofa that looked unused, a dining table set for one, chairs that seemed to have forgotten what conversation sounded. The air smelled of dust and old wood and something else, something that reminded Mercy of her mother's room during those final weeks before the consumption claimed her. "Your room is upstairs," Judge Caine said, not meeting her eyes. "The second door on the right. You'll find it has everything you need." Mercy climbed the narrow staircase, her footsteps muffled by a runner that had once been burgundy, but now showed the gray of age. The second floor was even quieter than the first, if such a thing were possible. Her room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the creek bed toward the desert beyond. She set her carpet bag on the bed and returned downstairs to find Judge Caine standing in his kitchen, staring at a cold stove as if it might spontaneously burst into flame. He had removed his black coat and stood in his shirt sleeves, and for the first time, Mercy could see the man beneath the judicial robes. He was thinner than she had realized, his shoulders carrying the kind of tension that comes from years of holding oneself apart from the world. "I don't suppose you know how to cook," he said without turning around. "Yes, sir. My mother taught me before she passed." "Your mother?" He spoke the words like they had a taste he could not identify. "Tell me about her." Mercy felt heat rise in her cheeks. "What would you like to know?" "Your Honor, my name is Thaddeus. You may call me that when we're in this house." He turned to face her then, and she was struck by how different he looked away from his bench. Smaller somehow. More human. "What was her name?" Sarah Whitman." Something flickered across his face, so quickly that Mercy almost missed it. He turned back to the stove, his hands gripping its edge until his knuckles showed white. "Sarah," he repeated, and the name seemed to catch in his throat. "And she died of consumption?" "Yes, sir. 5 years ago this winter. She fought it for nearly 2 years before it took her." He finished the sentence for her, his voice barely above a whisper. "And your father?" "Thomas Whitman." "How long were they married?" The question struck Mercy as odd, too personal for a man who had shown her nothing but judicial indifference in the courtroom. But something in his tone, a kind of desperate, careful control, made her answer honestly. "They weren't married long before I was born. Maybe 6 months. Mama used to say they had a whirlwind courtship." Mercy paused, studying the judge's rigid posture. "She said she knew him from her work at the courthouse. She was a clerk there before I came along." Judge Caine's hands were trembling now. She could see it in the way his fingers pressed against the stove's iron surface. When he spoke again, his voice was so low she had to strain to hear him. "Sarah worked in my courthouse for 3 years. She was a good woman. Intelligent. Kind. She deserved better than Thomas Whitman." The words hung between them like an accusation, though Mercy could not tell who was being accused. She wanted to ask how he had known her mother so well, why he spoke of Thomas Whitman with such controlled bitterness, why his hands shook at the mention of Sarah's name. Instead, she moved to the pantry and began taking inventory of what supplies were available. "I can make biscuits," she offered, "and there's salt pork here and some beans. That'll be fine." They worked in silence, Mercy preparing the evening meal, while Judge Caine, Thaddeus, sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that grew cold while he stared out the window toward the courthouse. Occasionally she caught him watching her, and each time their eyes met, he would look away as if he had been caught at something shameful. The biscuits were browning in the oven when Mercy noticed the way he held his coffee cup, cradled in both hands as if it might fly away if he loosened his grip. It was such a small gesture, but it spoke of a loneliness so profound it made her chest ache. "Judge Thaddeus," she corrected herself. "May I ask why you took responsibility for my debt?" He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his words seemed to come from somewhere deep and carefully guarded. "Because it was the right thing to do." "That's not an answer. It's the only answer I can give you right now." After supper, eaten in a silence broken only by the scrape of forks against plates and the distant howl of coyotes, Mercy cleared the dishes while Thaddeus retreated to his study. She could hear him moving around in there, the soft shuffle of papers, the creak of his chair, the occasional clink of glass against glass that suggested he kept a bottle somewhere among his law books. She finished the washing up and was about to go upstairs when she noticed that he had left his study door ajar. Through the gap, she could see him sitting at his desk, his head in his hands, surrounded by papers that caught the lamplight like fallen leaves. Mercy knew she should go to her room, should give him the privacy his posture demanded. Instead, she found herself drawn to the partly open door, compelled by something she could not name. His study was different from the rest of the house. Here, the silence felt expectant rather than oppressive. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Law books mostly, but also volumes of poetry and philosophy that suggested depths to Thaddeus Caine that his public persona never revealed. His desk was large and leather-topped, covered with legal papers and correspondence that spoke of a man who worked too much and slept too little. But it was what lay beside the papers that made Mercy's breath catch in her throat. A silver locket, tarnished with age, lay open on the desk surface. Inside, she could see the miniature portrait of a woman with auburn hair and green eyes, a woman who looked remarkably like the face Mercy saw in the mirror each morning. Beside the locket was a small Bible, worn smooth by countless hands, and a bundle of letters tied with a blue ribbon that had faded to the color of winter sky. Thaddeus looked up suddenly, as if sensing her presence, and their eyes met across the space between the doorway and his desk. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, deliberately, he closed the locket with fingers that shook like autumn leaves in wind. "That belonged to your mother," he said, and his voice carried the weight of 18 years of silence. "She left it behind when she left the courthouse." Mercy stepped into the room without invitation, drawn by a force she could not resist. "Why do you have it?" "Because I loved her." The words came out raw and unguarded, as if they had been pulled from somewhere he had tried to keep them buried. "Because I loved her, and I was a coward, and she paid the price for both." The truth settled over the room like dust after a windstorm, covering everything with a fine layer of understanding that changed the shape of it. Mercy looked at the locket, at the letters, at the man who sat before her with his secrets finally spilling into the light. She was going to leave Thomas Whitman, Thaddeus continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "She came to me one night, 18 years ago, with bruises on her arms and fear in her eyes. She said she couldn't live with him anymore, couldn't pretend she loved him when her heart belonged to someone else." Mercy felt the floor shift beneath her feet. "What happened?" "I told her to wait. I told her we had to be careful, that my position in the community meant we couldn't simply run away together like children. I told her I needed time to arrange things properly." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Time. As if love could be scheduled like a court proceeding." But she didn't wait. "No, Thomas found out about us somehow. He threatened to expose everything unless she agreed to stay with him. The scandal would have destroyed her reputation, and mine along with it. So she chose to protect us both by disappearing. By the time I realized what she had done, she was already married to Thomas and pregnant with you." The silence that followed was different from the oppressive quiet that had filled the house when Mercy first arrived. This was the silence of truth finally spoken, of secrets that had festered in darkness suddenly exposed to light. Mercy moved closer to the desk, close enough to see the tears that had begun to track down Thaddeus's weathered cheeks. Close enough to see her own eyes reflected in his. "Am I?" she began, then stopped, afraid to finish the question. "I don't know," he said, but his voice suggested otherwise. "I've wondered for 18 years. Every time I saw you in town, every time you appeared in my courtroom with your father, I wondered if I was looking at my own daughter." The word hung between them, like a bridge neither was ready to cross. Mercy reached out with trembling fingers and touched the locket, feeling the warmth it had absorbed from his hands. "She never told you. She never got the chance. By the time I worked up the courage to find her, she was already gone. Thomas took her away from Clearwater, and when they returned 2 years later, she was already sick. The consumption had its claws in her, and she had a daughter she was determined to protect." Mercy picked up one of the letters from the bundle, recognizing her mother's handwriting on the envelope. "These are from her. She wrote to me for 3 years after she returned. Always through intermediaries, always careful never to mention anything that might compromise either of us. But I could read between the lines. She was unhappy. Thomas drank and gambled and treated her like property he had won rather than a wife he had married. Why didn't you do something? Because I was a coward then, just as I was a coward the night she came to me for help. His voice broke on the words. I told myself it was better to let things be, that any intervention from me would only make things worse for both. I told myself that love sometimes meant staying away. And today, in the courthouse, today I saw her face in yours. I heard her voice in your questions, and I realized that 18 years of cowardice was enough. He looked up at her, and in his eyes, she could see the ghost of the man her mother must have loved. I don't know if you're my daughter, Mercy, but I know that you're the closest thing to Sarah I'll ever have again. And I'll be damned if I let you be sold like livestock to pay for Thomas Whitman's sins. Mercy set the letter down carefully, as if it might dissolve at her touch. When she spoke, her voice was steady despite the storm of emotions raging in her chest. What happens now? Now we try to figure out how to live with the truth, whatever that truth might be. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows and sending something, tumbleweeds or loose paper, skittering across the porch. Inside, in the lamplight of Thaddeus Caine's study, a 17-year-old girl stood looking at a man who might be her father, while her mother's locket gleamed between them like a promise that some secrets are too heavy to carry alone. When he spread her mother's letters across his desk like evidence in a trial, Mercy learned that some truths are more devastating than any lie, and that the man who raised her wasn't her father at all. The morning came gray and reluctant, seeping through the heavy curtains of Judge Caine's study like water through cracked stone. Mercy had not slept. She had lain in the narrow bed upstairs, staring at the ceiling while her mind turned over everything Thaddeus had told her, examining each revelation like a lawyer studying evidence. By the time she heard him stirring downstairs, she had made her decision. She found him in his study, still dressed in yesterday's clothes, surrounded by papers and books as if he had spent the night building walls of legal precedent around himself. The bottle she had suspected sat openly on his desk now, half empty, catching the weak morning light like amber tears. "You didn't sleep either," she said from the doorway. He looked up, and she could see the toll the night had taken on his face. His eyes were red-rimmed and hollow, his silver hair disheveled in a way that would have scandalized the courthouse regulars. When he spoke, his voice was rough with whiskey and exhaustion. "Sleep seems to require a clear conscience. I find myself lacking that particular luxury." Mercy entered the study without invitation, moving to the window and pulling back the heavy drapes. Sunlight flooded the room, harsh and unforgiving, illuminating the chaos of papers on his desk. She could see letters scattered like fallen leaves, legal documents mixed with personal correspondence, and in the center of it all, her mother's locket lying open like a wound. "You said you had letters from my mother," she said, turning to face him. "I want to read them. All of them." Thaddeus reached for the bottle, then seemed to think better of it. Instead, he gathered the scattered letters into a neat pile, his movements careful and deliberate, as if handling something that might explode if mishandled. Some truths are easier to live with when they remain buried, Mercy, and some lies become impossible to live with once you know they're lies. She moved to the chair across from his desk and sat down, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. "You've carried these secrets for 18 years. I think I have the right to know what my mother was thinking when she wrote." For a long moment, they stared at each other across the desk that held the remnants of a love affair that had shaped both their lives. Finally, Thaddeus picked up the first letter from the pile and held it out to her. "This one came 6 months after she married Thomas," he said. "It was delivered by a boy who claimed he didn't know who had hired him." Mercy took the letter with hands that trembled slightly. The paper was yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible in her mother's familiar handwriting. "My dearest friend, I hope this letter finds you well, though I fear it will bring you no comfort. I write to you from a place of such sorrow that I can barely find the words to express what I must tell you. I am a child. The timing leaves no doubt as to the father, and I pray you will understand why I cannot burden you with this knowledge openly. Thomas believes the child is his, conceived during our brief courtship. I will let him believe this lie, because the alternative would destroy not only my reputation, but yours as well. You have worked too hard to build your position in the community for it to be torn down by scandal. I think of you every day and wonder what might have been if we had been braver, if we had cared less about what others might think and more about what our hearts were telling us. But regrets are luxuries I can no longer afford. I have a child to protect now, and that protection requires sacrifice from us both. Please do not try to find me. Please do not try to contact me. Let this letter be goodbye to what we were and what we might have been. I will love you until my last breath, but I will love you from a distance that keeps us both safe. Forever yours in heart, if not in name. Sarah. Mercy read the letter twice before setting it down on the desk between them. When she looked up, Thaddeus was watching her with the expression of a man waiting for a verdict. She was protecting you, Mercy said quietly. She was protecting herself as well. And you. He reached for another letter. This one came a year later. The second letter was shorter, written in a hand that seemed less steady. My dearest friend, the child was born 3 weeks ago. A daughter. She has your eyes and my stubbornness. And when she looks at me, I see all the choices I made and all the ones I couldn't make. I have named her Mercy because mercy is what we both needed and what neither of us received. Thomas is not a cruel man, but he is not a kind one either. He drinks more than he should and gambles with money we don't have. I fear for what kind of life I can give her, but I fear more what kind of scandal would follow if I try to change our circumstance. I dream sometimes that you appear at our door and take us both away from this place, away from these lies we have to live. But I wake knowing that dreams are for children, and I am no longer a child. Watch over us from afar, if you can. That is all I dare ask. There are 12 more, Thaddeus said, his voice barely above a whisper. 1 or 2 each year until she stopped writing altogether. They get shorter as time goes on. Sadder. By the end, she was barely signing them at all. Mercy reached for the pile, but he pulled it back slightly. You should know what they say before you read them. She writes about you, about how you're growing, what you're learning, how you remind her of me. She writes about Thomas's drinking, his gambling, his increasing anger as their marriage fails. She writes about the consumption when it starts, how she tries to hide it from you for as long as she can. And she never asked you to help? Only once. In the last letter she ever sent. He pulled a single sheet from the bottom of the pile. This one came a month before she died. Mercy took it with hands that no longer trembled. Somehow, holding her mother's words, feeling the paper that her mother's fingers had touched, steadied her in a way that nothing else could. Thaddeus, I am dying. The doctor says I have weeks, perhaps days. Thomas has already begun drinking away what little money we have left, and I fear what will happen to Mercy when I am gone. I have never asked you for anything in all these years, but I ask you now, watch over her. She is 16 years old and believes Thomas Whitman is her father because that lie has protected us both. But when I am gone, that protection dies with me. She is strong, stronger than I ever was, but she is still a child in a world that does not value children, especially those without family or fortune to shield them. If something happens to Thomas, if his debts or his drinking catch up with him, she will have no one. I do not ask you to claim her. I do not ask you to reveal the truth. I ask only that you remember the love we shared was real, and that it created something beautiful and good. Remember that, and if you can find a way to help her without destroying yourself, please do. I have enclosed something that belonged to my mother. I want Mercy to have it when she is old enough to understand what love costs and what it's worth. Thank you for loving me, even when love meant letting go. Sarah. The silence that followed was different from any they had shared before. It was the silence of truth finally spoken in its entirety, of secrets that had poisoned the air finally brought into the light, where they could heal or kill cleanly. Mercy folded the letter carefully and set it back on the desk. When she looked up, she found Thaddeus watching her with an expression of such naked vulnerability that it took her breath away. "She knew," Mercy said. "She knew you were my father. She suspected, as did I. But suspicion and knowledge are different things." "Are they?" Mercy leaned forward, studying his face with new eyes. "Look at me, Thaddeus. Really look at me. What do you see?" He did as she asked, his gaze moving over her features with the careful attention of a man examining evidence in a case where the verdict would change everything. She saw the moment recognition crystallized in his eyes, the moment suspicion became certainty. "I see Sarah," he whispered, "but I see myself as well. The shape of your jaw, the way you hold your head when you're thinking, the way you ask questions that cut straight to the heart of things. Then we both know the truth now." Yes, the word came out like a confession, heavy with 18 years of wondering and fear and hope. We both know. What does that mean for us? What does that mean for what happens next? Thaddeus reached across the desk and took her hands in his. His fingers were warm and callous from years of handling law books and gavels, but they held hers gently, as if she were made of something precious that might break if handled roughly. "It means that I failed you once by letting your mother walk away when she needed me most. I failed her by being too concerned with my reputation to fight for what we had. I failed both of you by letting 18 years pass without trying to learn the truth." His grip tightened slightly. "But it also means that I won't fail you again." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that Judge Thaddeus Caine has made his last ruling in Clearwater Settlement. I'm saying that a man who has spent 30 years hiding behind a bench and a gavel is finally ready to step out from behind them and live like a human being." Mercy felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of tension she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. "And what about me? What about the debt?" "There is no debt. There never was, not really. A father doesn't owe money for protecting his daughter." He smiled then, the first genuine smile she had ever seen on his face. "But there's a choice to be made. You can stay here in this house, and we could try to build something like a family from the wreckage of all these years of silence. Or we can leave this place entirely. Start over somewhere where no one knows our names or our history. Where a man and his grown daughter can make their own way in the world without the weight of other people's expectations." Outside the study window, Mercy could see the courthouse where she had stood on the auction block just yesterday, though it felt like years ago now. She could see the main street of Clearwater Settlement, where she had lived her entire life believing one version of the truth, while another version waited in this very room to be discovered. "If we leave," she said slowly, "what happens to all this?" She gestured at the letters, the locket, the remnants of a love story that had shaped both their lives. "We take what matters and leave the rest behind. Your mother's letters, her locket, the truth about who you are and where you came from. The rest, the courthouse, the settlement, the life I built on lies and compromise, can stay buried in the dust where it belongs." Mercy looked at the man who had revealed himself to be her father in the space of a single day, at the evidence of a love affair that had cost her mother everything and given her life, at the choice that lay before them both. But when she spoke, her voice was clear and strong, carrying the certainty of a woman who had finally found solid ground after a lifetime of shifting sand. "Then we leave," she said. "We take what matters and leave the rest behind. But first, I want to visit my mother's grave. I want to tell her that the secret she died protecting finally brought us together." Thaddeus squeezed her hands once more, then released them to begin gathering the letters that would travel with them into their uncertain future. And as the morning sun climbed higher over Clearwater Settlement, neither father nor daughter looked back toward the life they were preparing to leave behind forever. He hung up his judge's robes forever that morning, because sometimes the greatest justice is knowing when to stop serving the law and start serving love. The cemetery lay on a small rise west of town, where the desert wind could carry prayers and sorrows alike toward the mountains that stood like silent witnesses on the horizon. Sarah Whitman's grave was marked by a simple wooden cross that Thomas had carved himself during one of his brief periods of sobriety, her name burned into the wood with letters that had weathered but not faded. Mercy knelt beside the grave while Thaddeus stood a respectful distance away, his hat in his hands, his silver hair catching the early morning light. She had brought wildflowers picked from the creek bed, desert marigolds, and purple sage that her mother had always loved, and she arranged them carefully at the base of the cross. "Hello, Mama," she said softly, her fingers tracing the letters of her mother's name. "I brought someone to meet you." "Well, to meet you again, I suppose." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of sage and dry earth, and for a moment Mercy could almost feel her mother's presence, as real and warm as the sun on her shoulders. She looked back at Thaddeus, who had moved closer but still maintained the careful distance of a man who had spent 18 years learning to love from afar. "He told me about the letters," Mercy continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "about everything you sacrificed to protect us both, about how you loved him enough to let him go, and loved me enough to keep the secret that would have destroyed us all." Thaddeus approached slowly, as if walking on sacred ground. When he reached the grave, he knelt beside Mercy and placed his own hand on the simple wooden marker. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he said, and his voice broke on her name. "I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough when it mattered. I'm sorry I let you face Thomas's anger alone. I'm sorry I let you die without ever telling you that every day for 18 years I wondered if I was watching my daughter grow up from a distance, unable to claim her or protect her or love her the way she deserved." Mercy reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers above her mother's grave. "She knew you loved her. She knew you loved me." That's what the letters were really about. Not goodbye, but connection. She was telling you about me because she wanted you to know your daughter, even if you couldn't claim her. They sat in silence for a long time, two people finally allowing themselves to grieve not just for Sarah, but for all the years they had lost to fear and silence. When Mercy finally spoke again, her voice was stronger, filled with a resolution that seemed to rise from the desert itself. "We're leaving today," she told her mother's grave. "We're going to California, where nobody knows our story but us. Where a father can love his daughter without shame, and where the past can finally rest in peace." Thaddeus squeezed her hand gently. "Your mother would have liked that. She always talked about California in her letters. Said it sounded like a place where people could start over. Then we'll go there for her. And for us." They rose together, brushing the dust from their knees, and walked back toward town hand in hand. Behind them, the desert marigolds nodded in the morning breeze, and Sarah Whitman's grave seemed somehow more peaceful, as if a long-held vigil had finally come to an end. The house on the edge of settlement had been transformed overnight. What had seemed like a shrine to solitude and regret now looked like what it truly was, a temporary shelter being abandoned by people ready to move toward something better. Mercy's few possessions were already packed in her carpet bag, while Thaddeus had spent the early morning hours selecting what to take and what to leave behind. 30 years of collecting law books," he said, gesturing toward the shelves that lined his study. "And in the end, the only justice that matters can't be found in any of them. What will you do with them? Leave them for whoever wants them. Maybe the next judge will find something useful in all that accumulated wisdom." He picked up a single volume, a collection of legal philosophy that looked well worn from use. "Though I suspect real wisdom has less to do with what's written in books and more to do with knowing when to close them and start living." On his desk, he had arranged the things that would travel with them. Sarah's letters, bound again with their faded blue ribbon, her silver locket, polished until it gleamed like new, a small leather journal that had belonged to his own father, and a photograph of the courthouse taken on the day he had first been appointed judge 30 years and a lifetime ago. "Any regrets?" Mercy asked, watching him pack these treasures into a leather satchel with the care of a man handling relics. Only that it took me this long to understand the difference between legal justice and human justice. Legal justice is about rules and precedents and maintaining order. Human justice is about love and mercy and second chances. He looked at her with eyes that had lost their judicial coldness and found something warmer in its place. I spent 30 years serving the law. I'd like to spend whatever years I have left serving something better. And what's that? Family. The word hung between them like a promise, simple and profound. Mercy had lived 17 years without knowing the man who was her true father. But somehow, in the space of 2 days, they had found their way to each other across the wasteland of secrets and silence that had separated them. A knock at the front door interrupted their packing. Thaddeus went to answer it, and Mercy could hear voices on the porch, Sheriff Dalton's familiar drawl, and someone else she didn't recognize. She moved to the window and saw a small crowd gathered in the street. Morton the banker, Mrs. Henderson from a boarding house, several of the men who had bid on her at the auction, and others whose faces she knew, but whose names had never mattered to her. Trouble? She asked when Thaddeus returned to the study. Questions. The whole town is buzzing about what happened in the courthouse yet. They want to know why I took custody of you instead of letting the bidding continue. They want to know why I'm packing up my house and resigning from the bench. He smiled grimly. They want explanations I'm not prepared to give them. What did you tell them? I told them that some decisions are personal and some are professional, and this one happens to be both. I told them my resignation letter will be on file at the county courthouse by the end of the week, and that my replacement can deal with any questions about legal precedent. His smile softened, and I told them that Miss Mercy Whitman is under my protection now, and anyone who has a problem with that arrangement can take it up with my successor. Through the window, Mercy watched the crowd on the street disperse slowly, their curiosity unsatisfied, but their power to interfere definitively ended. Morton lingered the longest, his pale face twisted with the frustration of a man who had lost not only money but control, but eventually even he shuffled away toward the bank where other people's debts awaited his attention. Are you ready? Thaddeus asked, shouldering his satchel and picking up a larger bag that contained their practical necessities, clothes, money, food for the journey. Mercy took one last look around the study that had become the birthplace of their relationship. The empty shelves, the desk cleared of everything but dust motes dancing in the morning light, the chair where she had sat while learning the truth about her parentage. It all seemed like artifact from someone else's life now. I'm ready. They walked through the house together, their footsteps echoing in rooms that would soon be empty of everything but memories. At the front door, Thaddeus paused and looked back one final time at the place where he had lived in exile from his own heart for so many years. Goodbye, he said quietly, though Mercy wasn't sure if he was speaking to the house or to the man he had been before he chose love over law. The wagon waited at the end of the stone path, loaded with their belongings and hitched to 2 sturdy horses that Thaddeus had purchased from the livery stable that morning. As they climbed up to the driver's seat, Mercy caught sight of faces watching from windows and doorways. The curious, the judgmental, the simply bored who had found entertainment in other people's drama. Let them watch, Thaddeus said, following her gaze. In a month, they'll have found someone else to talk about. In a year, they'll have forgotten we ever lived here. He snapped the reins, and the wagon lurched into motion, carrying them down the main street of Clearwater Settlement for the last time. They passed the courthouse where Mercy had stood on the auction block, where Thaddeus had wielded his gavel in service to a justice that had proved inadequate to the complexities of the human heart. They passed the general store, the saloon, the boarding house, all the familiar landmarks of the only life Mercy had ever known. At the edge of town, Thaddeus pulled the wagon to a stop and turned to look back at the settlement that had defined both their lives for so long. The courthouse bell was ringing 9 o'clock, calling the town to whatever business awaited it in their absence. In a few hours, someone would discover that Judge Thaddeus Caine's bench sat empty, his chambers cleared of everything but the official records that belonged to the county rather than the man. Any last words? He asked. Mercy considered the question seriously, watching the morning light play across the buildings that held all her childhood memories, good and bad alike. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of a woman who had learned the difference between what is and what ought to be. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you for giving me a choice yesterday, and for making one yourself today. Thank you for being brave enough to want the truth, even when it might have been easier to live with the lies." He snapped the reins again, and the wagon rolled forward into the desert that stretched endlessly westward toward California and possibility. Behind them, Clearwater Settlement grew smaller and smaller until it was just another cluster of buildings on a vast landscape, indistinguishable from all the other places where people tried to build lives from dust and hope and the occasional miracle of human connection. The sun climbed higher as they traveled, warming the desert air and casting their shadows long and dark on the road ahead. They talked as they rode, carefully at first, then with increasing ease as they began to learn each other's rhythms and preferences. Thaddeus told her about his own childhood, about the father who had been a traveling preacher and the mother who had died when he was not much older than Mercy. She told him about growing up with Thomas Whitman, about the good times before the gambling and drinking took hold, about her mother's quiet strength during those final years of illness. By midday, when they stopped to rest the horses and eat the lunch Mercy had packed, Clearwater Settlement was just a memory on the horizon behind them. Ahead, the road stretched toward mountains that looked blue and distant and full of promise. "No regrets?" Mercy asked as they sat in the shade of a Joshua tree, sharing bread and cheese and water from the canteen. "Only that it took us this long to find each other." Thaddeus looked at her with eyes that had learned to see family where once they had seen only duty. "But I've learned that the best justice isn't about punishing the past. It's about making space for the future to be better than what came before." "And is it better, I mean?" He smiled, and in that smile, Mercy could see the man her mother had fallen in love with 18 years ago, before fear and social convention had driven them apart. "Ask me again when we reach California." They climbed back into the wagon and continued west, toward whatever new life waited for them in a place where nobody knew their names or their story. The desert road was long and dusty, marked by the bones of animals that had not survived the journey and the dreams of people who had. But it was also marked by the tracks of those who had made it through, who had found what they were looking for or learned to want what they found. As the afternoon shadows grew long and the mountains drew closer, Mercy realized that the auction block in Clearwater Settlement had indeed set her free, not from her father's debts, but from a life built on half-truths and careful distances. She had been sold, in a way, but she had been sold to herself, to the family she had never known she had, to a future where love could be spoken aloud instead of hidden in letters and locked drawers. The gavel had fallen, and justice had been served. Not the kind written in law books, but the kind that lives in the heart's recognition of what matters most. And as the wagon rolled toward the sunset and the promise of tomorrow, both father and daughter understood that some auctions are meant not to enslave us, but to set us free from the very chains we thought were keeping us safe. In the end, Mercy had found justice, and justice had found love, and the desert had witnessed it all with the patient silence of a land that had seen everything and forgiven more.